And we are live. Greetings, everybody. Wonderful to be here with you. I really have been looking forward to this evening's webcast with great anticipation. We are currently live right now, and we have been getting numerous comments. I was just saying to Sean before we got on, I said, geez, we already have 2,460 comments on the Facebook comment thread. Now, it's not all from the last few minutes. We've been promoting this webcast for days to the Christ Revealed community, and people have been checking in and chiming in and asking questions and comments. And we're gonna do shout outs and get to as many of you as we possibly can as far as your questions and comments. But I can tell you that one of the big feedbacks we got from Christ Revealed, the actual docu-series, was from episode 1, where Sean McDowell was gracious enough to invite me into his home to sit down with the camera crew and disrupt everything, and to sit and have what I thought was one of the most meaningful conversations of my life. It wasn't even just the content of the conversation, but it was also the tone of the conversation. And he's just got extraordinary intelligence and wisdom, and is able to articulate his message in such a way that I think someone would have to be really kind of dark and toxic not to feel good about what he's saying. And that's why they need to get this message, because they need to get over being dark and toxic. So Sean, thanks so much for spending some time with us tonight.
Oh my goodness, this is a treat. Thanks for that kind introduction. I'm happy to be back with the Christ Revealed community. This is a treat.
Thank you. So we obviously want to spend some time talking about my camera goes blurry. There it is. It's talking about the resurrection, because we're just a few days away from Easter, and I think a lot of us are looking forward to it with anticipation. But tonight I felt like we want to maybe start to wrap our minds and hearts and spirits around the whole concept of the resurrection, what it meant, the crucifixion, some details around that, etc. But before we go there, can we just start with a little bit of your background, just in case people didn't see Christ Revealed and they didn't get the detail about how you came to this place in life where you are right now. Can you give us maybe the thumbnail on that?
Yeah, sure. Happy to share. I grew up in a Christian home where my parents were on crusade staff and still are on crusade staff, Campus Crusade for Christ, that is. And some of your listeners may recognize the name of my father, Josh McDowell, who's written a ton of books, been in public ministry probably 55 plus years. And growing up in that home, honestly, in high school, I thought people weren't Christians because they just hadn't read my dad's book. Like, how hard is it? Here's the evidence for the resurrection. And of course, as I got a little older into college and met people with very different views, started searching the internet. This is mid-90s when people really had access to this information. I learned that the secular web really began responding to a lot of my father's material. And I read some really smart people pushing back. And needless to say, it was kind of unsettling to me, thinking, gosh, my parents meant well. They did their best to raise me, but what if they're wrong? And I remember having a conversation with my dad saying, Dad, I know you love me and did your best. I'm just not sure if I think this Christian thing is really true. And he looked at me and goes, son, I think that's great. And I remember going, like, did I miss something? Why would that be great? And he said, well, because I've raised you to seek after truth, and you can't live on my convictions. If you seek after truth, you'll be led to Jesus, and your mom and I will love you no matter what. And I don't want to over dramatize that experience. There's much more in my faith journey, but that was a real pivotal moment where I really said, all right, I got to believe this if it's true, if it makes sense. Really, and since then, I've read a lot of books for and against my beliefs, and I'm convinced Jesus is risen from the grave, and I've committed my life to writing and speaking on this, and in particular, working with students in the next generation is what I enjoy.
And with that, and this was one of the things I found really remarkable about our conversation, is that you do a lot of work with students, and you're kind of following the same path in the sense of saying, rather than trying to shield them from contradictory positions or adversity relative to their Christian faith, instead, you bring them to places to engage in dialogue and conversation. I think you told us you brought them to an atheist group at Berkeley. You went to a mosque and had an interaction with Iman, I think on the East Coast. So talk about that a little bit. Yeah,
one of the things my parents raised me is just to never be afraid of people with different ideas or different ideas. My dad, anytime I had an opinion, he'd say, son, have you read both sides? Have you considered other perspectives? And just built that into me. The older I get, the more I realize how powerful and important that was in our age of fake news, to really have a discipline, a commitment to consider all sides, or as many sides you can, of an issue. My parents also raised me kind of to inoculate me rather than to just shield me from other ideas. That might have worked in previous generations, but now with smartphones, which is probably the defining characteristic of this generation, our kids are exposed to all sorts of ideas. So I started taking my students, and this was really at the encouragement of a friend of mine, Brett Kunkel, who has just a ministry called Maven, and another guest on your show, Jay Warner Wallace, really first started doing this. And I just piggybacked on their idea and said, let's take our students to Berkeley. Let's go to Salt Lake City and engage with people that have a different view about the person of Jesus. Let's go and meet with some Muslims. And I found that students love it. I mean, I think this generation rises to the challenge when we get them out of their comfort zones, give them something to try that's different. And I found that students just love it. I mean, I've done a lot of different things in ministry with young people, and bringing atheists in, bringing Muslims in to speak to them. There's nothing like that has their attention and their interest and their willingness to really study the scriptures.
So, and I just think that it's how can I put it? It shows a level of confidence and certainty, and not being afraid, or your faith feels fragile, but something that is to be enjoyed and to be interacted with. So it's just a great context. So,
you know what? Can I rudely cut in? I would have to say a lot of that confidence comes with experience. One of the things I believe we talked about last time is at churches I go around, I put on these fake glasses. In fact, I think they're in my drawer. And I role play an atheist, and I invite questions and pushback and dialogue. And typically Christians will get defensive and upset. And I'll say to them, why'd you get so defensive and upset? And after a while, someone will say, it's because we really don't know what we believe and why. And it's true. If we don't know why we think Jesus rose from the grave, or the Bible's true, or why God allows evil, or why Jesus is the only way, and someone presses us, it's natural to get defensive. But the more I've had conversations, the more I've studied, the more confident I am that, wow, Christianity's really true. I don't have all the answers, but it makes far more sense than any worldview that's out there. So I think if Christians are willing to get outside of their comfort zone and just engage people, read a little bit, you'll find your confidence will grow, which I think creates an excitement and willingness to talk with people of a different faith.
For sure. And I think it's very liberating to be able to say, I don't have all the answers. And quite frankly, nobody does. So I think it's a real liberating thing to not feel like you have to be able to answer every little thing, otherwise the whole thing crumbles down. It's about nobody has all the answers. So, and this is kind of the joy of it, is that you get to grow in it over year after year after year, as compared to feeling like, oh my God, I'm afraid to go out into the world because if somebody challenges me on something, I don't have a good answer, it means that none of this is valid. And that's just not the case.
Well, that's really true. Just about a week and a half ago, I had a chance to be with my father and my son in Singapore, and just a remarkable country. And we spoke at a couple universities there, did a conference, and somebody stood up. I was speaking on a totally unrelated topic, and somebody asked me about the historicity of Daniel and the dating. And I just sat there. I said, honestly, that's a great question. I have no idea. I haven't researched that in years. If you email me, I'll find the answer. I'll help you out. Now, I didn't hear from him, so I don't think it was that sincere of a question, but I have no problem saying I don't understand. And I think Christians should have no problem. My dad taught me, he said, son, there's nothing wrong with saying you don't know once, but don't let it happen to you twice. Go find the answer and be ready the next time. And I've tried to do that. That's
great. What a great advice you got. So now let's dive in, if we can, to some questions that I think, especially ones I think are germane to Easter and what's coming up, and can bring some consciousness around the crucifixion, the resurrection, and other elements of that time. So Mike from, sorry, I'm getting blurred here. My camera, like when I move a little, it starts to blur. So if you see me put my hand up, I'm trying to get the refocus. So Mike from Atlanta asked this question. He said, a lot of people have no idea what the Roman crucifixion was like. Can you give us better detail on that?
Yeah, this is a great question. I'm glad that Mike asked it. In some ways, it's so ironic that we call the day Jesus died Good Friday. I mean, just stop and think about that. In what other religion, and maybe there's one out there I'm not aware of, but in what other religion does a group of people celebrate the brutal torture and crucifixion of their founder? I mean, some people love Abraham Lincoln or JFK and get together and celebrate their lives, but I don't know anyone who gets together and celebrates the day that they died. Not only do we celebrate it, but we call it good. I mean, that's even more ironic when we understand the nature of Roman crucifixion. Now, the Romans did not invent crucifixion, but what they did is they perfected it in a sense. And perfected is probably a bad word choice, because perfected in the sense of just trying to make it as absolutely torture-filled, as excruciating, as humiliating and shameful as possible. Because to be crucified was to be considered an enemy of the Roman state. So they did this publicly without any care for the humaneness of the way it was done. In fact, as I just mentioned a minute ago, the word excruciating was actually invented out of the Latin. It literally means out of the cross, because the pain was so extreme that they had to invent a new word for it. So next time you stub your toe, use a different word. I often tell my kids that excruciating. So essentially what they would do is they would whip somebody. And by the way, when I saw The Passion, a lot of people said I had no idea the crucifixion was so bad. Honestly, Patrick, my response was, wow, they underdid it. They underdid it. Now, he had to underdo it for the sake of the film. I think it was appropriate the way he depicted it. But there are a lot of things they couldn't show that make crucifixion even more horrific. So when Jesus was whipped, the Jews would only whip a certain number of times, say 40 because of the law, but Jesus was whipped by the Romans. And this wasn't like an Indiana Jones whip. This was like a cat o' nine tails that had either wood or bone at the end of it, or metal, which kind of like when you tenderize meat, so to speak, that the bone would catch in the skin and rip off pieces of flesh. So one doctor that my father and I researched said it's like a 3rd-degree burn on half the body just from the whipping alone. And then, of course, he's carrying his cross to the top. And when they nail him to the top, we found remains of about 5 to 7 inch spikes that would go right through your wrists. Now, it says, sometimes translated in English, the palm, but if you put it through the palm, it would actually tear through. But in the Greek language, the palm would include this entire area of the hand. So either they'd put it through here and then put rope, or they'd nail it right through there, which goes to the funny bone to lock it in, which is like putting pliers and just squeezing your funny bone as hard as you possibly can. Stretch your arms out, stretch your feet out, and then you're put up on the cross. And when the cross was dropped down in, the entire body would jar because the pain of being nailed up, by the way, completely naked. So you were utterly shamed in front of people. And when somebody was dropped down in and their body was so hurting, they would actually lose control of different bodily fluids. People would throw up, people would be sweating, people would go to the bathroom, and you just see the body in absolute shock. Birds are coming and pecking at it. And sometimes people were up on the cross for days, just getting sunburn, wasting away, and slowly dying. Now, we know Jesus died within a span of about 3 hours. But essentially, crucifixion was designed to cause maximal pain, maximal humiliation in a public way. So anybody watching this would fear Rome. In fact, they even reserved most Roman citizens from being crucified because it was so brutal. And that's exactly what they did to Jesus, was crucify him.
Wow. Well, that I think fills in the image in a deeper way, and it's, you kind of counterpose that with you saying this is Good Friday, and so why is it good? So maybe talk about why we can, after understanding the nature of Roman crucifixion, which is the worst form of it, now look back and say that this is a good day.
It's a good day for 2 reasons. Number one, Jesus, when he dies on the cross, says, "It is finished." And I think he means the mission that Jesus called him to finish. But he's also saying the Old Testament covenant is finished. And if anyone's read the Old Testament, they would know that when God chose his people to be in holy relationship with him, were all these rules and regulations, because God is so holy, including certain kinds of sacrifices. Well, all those sacrifices were only temporary. When Jesus dies on the cross, and you see the curtain tear in Matthew from the top down, by the way, from God down to the people, now there's no separation between God and between the common man, so to speak. Because of what Jesus has done, we can approach Jesus in relationship. That's why it's good. Now, ultimately, it wouldn't be good if Jesus hadn't risen from the grave. And this is what Paul talks about. And we see over and over in the scriptures, in 1 Corinthians 15, in the book of Acts, all the things that the resurrection means. So number one, it means that we can grieve with hope because death has been conquered. I mean, the resurrection means that death, which is really the great enemy that philosophers spend time all the way back to the ancient Greeks. How does your worldview help you confront death? Does it make sense of it? Does it give you hope? And in 1 Thessalonians, Paul distinctly says, we don't grieve as those without hope. We grieve with hope. So the resurrection of Jesus uniquely gives us a fresh way and a confidence to face death, which is why in 1 Corinthians 15 at the end, and that's a full chapter on resurrection, Paul starts taunting death. He's mocking it. And he had experienced suffering as much as anybody. He says, death, where is your victory? Death, where is your sting? It's not over. Death has been conquered because Jesus rose from the grave. I think it also means that we've been forgiven. So it is universal human experience to feel guilt. And I often, for my atheist and skeptical friends, I'll often say, how does your worldview help you deal with guilt? How does it help you process it? And I don't think there's a good answer in this kind of Darwinian worldview. Well, the Christian worldview says we feel guilty because we are guilty. But our guilt has been paid through the person of Jesus Christ, and we can experience forgiveness. So it's Good Friday because Jesus paid the debt we couldn't pay. And it was good because Jesus knew that he was going to resurrect on the third day and offer salvation for everybody who believes in him. And the irony is that God takes the worst conceivable death and the moment where all the apostles are disillusioned, thinking it's over, we've lost, Jesus wasn't a prophet. And it's actually at that moment that God was doing his greatest good. And to me in my life, at times when I suffer or I see pain and I wonder, man, what is God doing? He must not have his hand on the steering wheel. I'm reminded of this and I think, man, at what seemed to be the darkest day, at the greatest human injustice, God was in the greatest control. So maybe he's in control of what's happening right now, even if I don't see it, even if I don't understand it. That's the kind of hope that someone who believes in the resurrection can hang on to.
Very well stated. One of the things that I think is maybe important to reflect upon, because I think so often, Easter becomes about, bunnies and eggs, and we got to kind of put the meaning back into it, is just the resurrection. You kind of talk about the meaning of it and its implications and the hope that it gives to the world. What would you say are some of the strongest proofs to validate that this actually occurred? That's not a nice story, that there's literally some powerful and rational evidence to support the resurrection.
Yeah, if you don't mind, let me frame for people 3 questions I think the resurrection answers, and then we'll jump into the proof, if that's all right with you, because I think sometimes it's easy to miss the significance of this.
It's perfect. Go ahead.
The first thing we know is if Jesus rose from the grave, we know that God exists. I mean, let's face it. One of the biggest questions people want to know is there a God and has this God spoken? Well, if I walk outside in my car and there's a huge dent in the front and you happen to be walking out the street, I go, Patrick, what happened? You go, man, I saw the whole thing. I said, what happened? He said, a feather floated down from the sky and hit my car. Now, I have a Ford, so I wouldn't believe it. If it was a Chevy, I might believe it. I'm just kidding. Now, I do have a Ford. I wouldn't believe that. Because why? Because a feather couldn't cause something as huge as the damage like that. An effect needs a sufficient cause. Well, if it was predicted ahead of time, somebody would die, be buried 3 days, and then come back from the dead, it requires supernatural power over life and death, which tells us the God Jesus believed in is real. So if Jesus rose from the grave, we know God exists. Second, we know which religion is true. Of all the great major religions of the world. It's only Christianity in which its leading founder claimed to be God and gave testable, verifiable historical evidence we can consider, namely the resurrection as a sign to validate his claims. So if Jesus really died, rose on the third day, this is like God's stamp of approval saying, you know what? The message Jesus spoke has authority. So number one, God exists. Number two, which religion is true. Number three, I think we know there's life after death. I mean, that's one of the biggest questions people wrestle with, myself included. When my heart stops beating and my brain stops functioning, does life continue? Well, there was a, I think 1990 or 1991 movie called Flatliners with Oliver Platt and Julia Roberts and Kevin Bacon and Kiefer Sutherland. And they redid it last year, but the original—
I was going to say, they did a remake of that, yeah.
I couldn't get myself to see it with the low ratings it got, but the original—
Yeah, I heard it was pretty bad.
That's what I heard too. The original I enjoyed, you know, back in like high school. And the thinking is there's a bunch of medical students who don't know if there's life after death. So they flatline each other's hearts. So somebody dies, and then they bring him back and they ask him. Well, it's a morbid experiment, but it kind of makes sense. If you want to know what's on the other side, talk to someone who's been there. Well, Jesus didn't die for 30 seconds or 3 minutes like in the movie. He died for 3 days. And he says in John 14, I'm going to prepare a place with my Father for you. So if you just realize how important this resurrection is, in fact, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, if Jesus has not risen, our faith is in vain. All of Christianity rests on a single testable historical event. So evolution is important, but if some kind of evolution happened and Jesus rose from the grave, Christianity is true. This is the heart of the question, the single most important question Christians should ask, skeptics should investigate. And if it's true, it's the single most important historical event ever. That's why this issue matters so much.
Yeah, and it's I guess the central core of contention, because exactly right, the detractors, you know, need to attack this because, like you said, it's the foundational piece that without it, you know, the rest can't stand. What I find interesting, you know, you and I were talking a little bit before we started, and I was telling you about, it's amazing that I've been, you know, the attacks that, you know, I've personally received or Christ Revealed has received, you know, for doing the work that we did. And, you know, we really did try to approach this, you know, from a very rational and logical and intellectual standpoint. That's why we call it the history. I mean, there's a historical record, the evidence, what supports that historical record, evident from the side, from the realm of evidence, and then the inspiration. So with this history, with this evidence, how does it translate to inspiration in the lives of people and in the world? And I was just today, you know, somebody sent me a link saying, check this out, and went to a blog where literally a guy had watched every episode, went line by line through the entire episode. I'm talking about blog posts that are like books, you know, and refuting things and casting aspersions, etc. And it's fascinating to me, you know, where people might get hung up. And a part of what I wanted to, you know, respond was saying, listen, because you and I said this, you know, we don't have the answers to everything. Nobody has the answers to everything. And you know, I'm a big fan, you know, of you know, especially the more recent history of physics. And, you know, I've read a lot of books and watched documentaries on Einstein and the interactions between Einstein and Niels Bohr, who were two of the most brilliant physicists of their time, who were, you know, historic figures who did remarkable things in the realm of science. And most of the history written about the two of them and the friendship that they had is their, you know, pretty much violent disagreements over, you know, what they were trying to interpret by the evidence that they saw. And so if for somebody to try to pretend that they know the ultimate nature of things conclusively through objective proof and logic, you know, my response to them typically is, listen, if Einstein and Bohr could not agree on the ultimate nature of reality, you know, who are you to start to try to proclaim that you have it? And to me, that's a part of the great, you know, mystery of life that keeps it interesting and keeps us, you know, constantly, you know, searching for meaning and answers. So I found it because, I saw, this guy reviewing kind of, our conversation and, the things that he picks up, which most of which is so inconsequential. And quite frankly, I could spend hours and hours trying to, respond, which I really don't have the time, maybe, nor the inclination. But here's what I, want to say about this. And I think it's just so empowering in what you've been describing, is that there's no doubt that faith is under attack, and it's under attack by people who maybe have some academic background and credentials, and maybe they have a different conclusion, that's driven by such a multitude of factors nobody could ever dissect them. But ultimately, I love the ability for you to enter into this arena to discuss these issues, and what you just did is you gave history, you gave evidence, and then it translates into something that's very inspiring in the conclusion. And so anyway, I just, when we talk about especially Easter, since Easter's coming up, along those lines, what is the inspiration for you that you feel, during the Easter holiday and the contemplation of all this?
Well, I guess when it's all said and done, I really think the Christian story is true. I think it's true. And it's the greatest truth that Jesus said that sets people free. I've seen that truth transform lives, in particular, my father's life. I mean, if people know my father's story, setting out, interestingly enough, I just watched the movie I Can Only Imagine. I brought my kids, and it was a wonderful movie. I loved it on so many levels. And I sat there with tears in my eyes because the story of Bart, the leading character, is so similar to my father's story of having a father who, they didn't show him as a drunk, but a distant, harsh father, being angry at God, trying to find your place in the world and understand who God is. I mean, that was my father's story. I grew up in Michigan, had a father who was abusive. My father was sexually abused by someone who lived on their farm for years. His older sister committed suicide. Just painful. We were sitting around as a family a while ago, and my mom was sharing funny stories of growing up in Boston. And my younger sister goes, "Hey, Dad, share a good memory you have when you were a kid." Patrick, it was awkward silence. My dad goes, "Kids, I don't have one." And I thought, not one? Well, my dad is the most joy-filled person I know. I mean, he's like the cup is 95% full, maybe 98%. And I really believe that when he came to the conclusion that Christianity was true, that God began to change his heart from the inside, to forgive the person who had abused him terribly, to forgive his father and see his father come to Christ. So the kinds of things I've seen from this story motivate me to believe in it, to defend it, to articulate it, to talk about it. When you asked me to come on the show and say, you get to talk to people about the resurrection, I said, when and where? Let's do it. And I think the way you framed this earlier, if I could add a couple things, sometimes people just talk about Easter. It's just a historical event. Here's the facts. That's the angle they talk about it. On the other hand, sometimes people just talk about the meaning. But what's unique about Christianity is the meaning entirely relies upon the objective truth of the events. It's both. It's actually true. Jesus died, he was buried, rose on the third day, and he appeared to people. It wasn't a hallucination. This isn't a story invented years later, copied from pagan myths. This really actually happened. And it's that story that has existential meaning. And like we saw in Imagine, it's that story, that same Jesus, I Can Only Imagine, is still changing lives today. So you ask me what motivates me. At the end of the movie, Bart says, he goes, when I saw what God did in the life of my father, I want to proclaim it to everybody. And I wasn't alive when my dad's life changed initially, but I've read about it, I've heard about it. And in the time I've been around, I've seen his life continue to change along with tons of other lives because of the teaching of Jesus, because of the Holy Spirit. I can't but help proclaim it. That's what motivates me.
That's awesome. I'm going to do some shout outs just because people are commenting on the stuff that you're saying, and I want to give them an opportunity. So Michael Henderson from, he's a senior pastor at the First Baptist Church. He said, great points, especially point 3. It was during his suffering that God was doing his greatest good.
Amen.
So he resonated with that. Georgia from Michigan. Hi, this is Georgia. I'm watching from Heartland, Michigan. I've so enjoyed this wonderful series. Wonderful documentary. What a beautiful way to share Jesus. Thank you, Georgia. We got Pascal, who said, yes, no one has all the answers, but the Word of God does, and we just need to open our Holy Bible. Excellent comment there, Pascal. Thank you for chiming in. Incidentally, some people are asking, how do we, can I see the series? In honor of Easter, to help celebrate it, we are re-releasing it right now. So if you want to watch the series, you can watch it for free. There's a link. It was at the top. It's not there now. I'm just looking at my screen. So you'd have to go to freeviewing.christrevealed.com. If you go there, you can register and watch the whole thing for free. So it would start today, actually, and then carry all the way through, right through Easter for the next several days. And you can see the entire journey that we took. And I have to say that part of that journey is our trip that we took to Israel. So, can you describe your experience of, when you've been to the Holy Land?
Oh my goodness. I've had a chance to go 3 times when I was about 10, about 6 or 7 years ago, and then this past fall. And I'll never forget on this most recent trip, right when we arrived and we're walking through our kind of our travel guide, he said these words. He said to us 2 words. He said, "Welcome home." And I walked out and I started seeing the places of Israel, and I thought, oh my goodness, there's nowhere in the world that I've only spent a little bit of time of my life that I feel so at home. So seeing the places, the Mount of Olives, where obviously Jesus taught from, walking through Hezekiah's tunnel, which is powerful archaeological confirmation of a story well over 2,800 years ago, taking a boat ride on the Sea of Galilee, visiting Qumran, where people found the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, you can't put it in words. And I know resources are a limitation for some people to go there, but if you have a chance to go, certainly watch the series and see the part where you show and you talk about this. But Israel, it's life-changing, not to mention the food was just unbelievable as well.
I echo that. I really love the food over there. It was, I shared exactly that experience getting there, because it was one thing, because when we were filming Christ Revealed, we were going across the country and speaking to you and many other people in the Christian community that are just brilliant thinkers. And it's one thing that when it lives abstractly in your mind, that is that certainly stimulates and inspires. But when we got to Israel and you're on the dirt, it is an entirely different experience, bringing a new dimension of meaning to it all. And one of the things living in the United States, growing up in the United States, and I travel a lot. I've traveled the world through my varying businesses and so on. So I've seen a lot of the world. But this was absolutely different. And it was different, I think, because of literally the purpose of the trip was to really dig deep and explore. And we went to varying archaeological digs and spoke to some experts about things that went on there. Some things were even recent, and we went through the whole country. The place of Christ's ministry, Magdala, where they found the Magdala stone, and got a whole understanding of that. And Sea of Galilee, the whole ministry, or so much of it was right around that area. So the Mount of Beatitudes, being able to see this. So that's where the Sermon of the Mount happened. It just somehow gives you this sense of awe. But what was really interesting for me is that I had such a sense, I think many Westerners do, that, hey, especially if you grew up in the United States, you feel like this is kind of the cradle or the center of Western civilization. And you get to Israel and you spend a little time there and you realize pretty quickly, this is it. This is where it all began and spread. So I found it to be quite fascinating. And incidentally, one of the number one requests that we got from people in the Christ Revealed community was they wanted to do a tour like we did. So Tisha, who was our tour guide, who hands down the best tour guide in the country and has been doing it for a lot of years. She runs all my Huckabee's tours, or did for years. I think he's got his own tour company now. Anyway, we decided we're going to run 2 tours in October. So it'll be like the first 8 days and the second 8 days of October. So we're putting it together now, folks. I don't have any real details, but just, stay on our list, on the Christ Revealed list that we email you to. And we'll be releasing information about it, I'm sure, in the coming weeks. But I'm looking forward to going out and bringing my whole family and being there for several weeks in October. And for the people who are really inspired and want to do the tour similar to the way that we did it and meet the people that we met, we'll be able to replicate that. So we're looking forward to getting you out there. Oh
my goodness. I would encourage viewers to do anything they can to get there, especially if they haven't. On the first tour that we led, we had some people going back and selling things that they've had in their family for years. It's the only way they could afford to go. And this lady in particular that sold kind of an heirloom that had been passed down to her, something real valuable. I had a chance to baptize her in the Jordan River. And she just said, "Are you kidding me? This is so worth it. No material thing could come close to this experience." And I'll tell you one of my highlights of being there, on the south side of the wall, even people that haven't been there can envision, if you're on the south side looking up at the center of Jerusalem where the temple is, there's these steps that walk up, and I'm walking up them. They're not very easy to walk up. They're long platforms. And I always wondered, why did they build them like this? Well, if you read the Psalms, there's certain Psalms that say Psalms of Ascent. Now, you're supposed to read these Psalms either as you're ascending to Jerusalem because it's on a hill, or you're ascending up to the temple. Now, they did the steps that way, so you couldn't just skip steps and do it meaninglessly, but every single step you had to slow down and focus on where you were, the character of God, the nature of salvation, and you just can't experience that anywhere else in the world. So I'm glad you're doing the trip, and I hope as many people as possible will join you.
Sorry, I mute my mic sometimes so you don't hear background noise while you're talking. Thank you. I'm excited. I think it will be a life-changing experience for others. I want others to experience what you and I have. It's one of those things that you try to describe it, but you really have to kind of show up.
That's right.
And experience it firsthand. So, Sean, with people now that, we've got them watching us from around the world, who've dialed in, who are excited about your message and the vision of Christianity that you brought into the world. And they are now going to be celebrating Easter with their families on Sunday. Being a family man yourself and growing up in a Christian family, what advice might you have for parents to say, here's something that maybe should be a part of the experience or the conversation of Easter or on Easter? What do you think, like when you had these conversations with your kids as they were growing up, what did you say to them on Easter?
Let me share something I remember my parents did when I was a kid. We happened to share this Easter at Laguna Beach, which is in Orange County, Southern California. And we went down to the beach, and my dad made a sand tomb with his hands. I don't even remember what it was out of. Maybe it was like a cup top that would be like a rock to block the tomb. Had a little body. And we went down in the sand and read the story about the resurrection. And then he actually walked us through. He goes, "Son, do you know some people believe that the body was actually stolen? That Jesus didn't rise from the grave, the apostles stole it." He'd say, "Well, what do you think about that?" I'm like 8 or 10. I didn't have any good response. But then he kind of walked me through like, "Well, that doesn't make sense. Why would they suffer and be willing to die for something they knew was false?" He'd say, "Well, some people said they went to the wrong tomb. Like the disciples walked in." He's like charting it out in the sand. They went to a different tomb. How come that doesn't make sense? And then we'd talk about it a little bit. He said, "Well, because the Romans knew where the tomb was. The women knew where the tomb was. Like, did they all get it wrong? That kind of doesn't make sense." And he just read the Easter story, but visually kind of depicted this. You could do it in a sandbox. You'd go to the beach. It was a visual way. And still to this day, probably 3 decades plus later, I remember that kind of experience. So we had Easter egg hunts growing up. We did all the fun stuff. I don't personally have a problem with that. But I just encourage families to carve out some specific time, however they can, maybe on Sunday, and just say, "Can we read the story? I just want to share with you as a dad, as a mom, what this is about." And make sure amidst our commercialization and consumerism in America, we don't miss this and are just thankful for what Jesus did for us. And I think it's amazing if you're creative and you pause and do this, your kids will remember it for a long time.
What a great bit of advice. And, you know, I think because rather than just being, again, an abstract story, sit down while I tell you an abstract story, it's kind of bring it to life. You know, you get the tactile aspect of it, you know, kind of the proprioceptive aspect if you're moving while you're showing the different possibilities. And it kind of reiterates the general nature of what your father has taught, or his way of teaching, which is, let's look at all the considerations. You know, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? You know, the so-called Socratic method: ask questions, don't give the answers, and let people come to their own conclusions. But I think that that's a phenomenal foundation from which to have a family experience relative to Easter. And to be able to bring these things to life and understand the meaning of it. So really good stuff. Now, you sort of were mentioning some of the, I think, important aspects of the resurrection. You know, as we spoke to many people, you mentioned J. Warner Wallace earlier, you know, who was also in Christ Revealed. And you start to look at, okay, so here are some of the possible explanations about, you know, the empty grave, right? And you kind of glossed over them kind of quickly, but maybe we should dig into a couple of those just because we're having this conversation, and talk about the fact that there are these sort of alternate explanations of the grave, and why it was empty and what happened. So I think you might have mentioned, but let's dig in a little bit as far as the top two or three.
I think this is a great idea. And because we've hit on the evidence a little bit, I want to give some of our listeners perspective. I mentioned earlier that my father, who set out to disprove Christianity, ended up becoming Christianity was true. And he wrote a book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict in 1972, just kind of compiling the evidence. Well, this past fall, we updated it together. And I asked him, I said, Dad, you've been doing this like half a century. How does the evidence we have now compared to what existed in the 70s? And the word that he used, he said, son, the evidence for the scriptures, the deity of Christ, and the resurrection, and for Christianity as a whole, is like a tsunami. Now that's powerful with someone with probably more perspective than you and I put together, Patrick, to say that. And I mention that because I want people listening to know that we have nothing to be afraid of about the truth. We have nothing to be afraid of about challenges to our faith, such as the kind that you're asking me about. Perhaps one of the most common objections to the faith is what's called kind of this idea that Jesus didn't even exist and that Christianity is a copycat religion from these other pagan myths that existed long before Christianity. Now, this isn't popular in academic circles, but it's hugely popular on the internet because now everybody has a voice and can fish around and project what they think is true. And the idea would be that when you look at these ancient figures like Mithras and Adonis and Osiris, that some of them, like Mithras in particular, had 12 disciples, was born of a virgin, was a miracle-working son of God, resurrected on the third day after being brutally put to death. And the claim is that the story predates Christianity and Christianity just borrowed from it. Well, when I first heard that in college, that was unsettling to me. I thought, man, is there nothing unique about Christianity? Is it just a myth? Well, I researched a little further and I discovered a few things. Number one, the chronology is all wrong. So these ancient mythologies existed before Christianity, but any of the so-called parallels come after Christianity rather than before. So I think we could actually make a case that some of these religions borrowed from Christianity rather than the other way around. Second, the parallels are really, really bad and really, really poor. So people use the same words, salvation, resurrection, but what they mean by them are very, very different. So the story that I've heard last time I looked at Wikipedia on this was that Osiris was a dying and rising God resurrected on the third day like Jesus. I don't know if this still says that, but it used to say that. And I thought, wow, that sounds kind of like the Christian story. Well, what happened is Osiris was murdered. He actually got tricked into climbing into a chest. It was locked, thrown in the bottom of the ocean. His sister puts all his parts back together except for one, comes back alive and becomes god of the underworld. Now, honestly, is that the kind of story that Christianity is patterned after? The answer is no way. There's no way. So this pagan mythology is hugely popular, hear it all the time, but there's no good historical reason to take it seriously that the Christians borrowed from this one. That's one of the most popular ones I hear. Probably the most popular academic claim is that the appearances of Jesus were just hallucinations. And I'll tell you something that's fascinating, Patrick, is the vast majority of scholars today, from the left to the right, that study the resurrection, so New Testament scholars, biblical scholars, agree that the apostles had experiences in which they thought was the risen Jesus. Almost all scholars agree on that because the evidence is consistent and it's early, and I think it's very powerful. So one way of explaining that away without it being the real resurrection are hallucinations. Well, the problem with hallucinations, there's a bunch, is number one, you have a variety of people having experiences in a very different kinds of emotional states. And it just doesn't fit even statistically, or what we know of the kind of people that have hallucinations. Some people would say, okay, maybe Paul, but now you got Peter. You also have the 12. You have the women. You have the 500. There's too many appearances to be explained as a hallucination. But probably even more problematic for this is that hallucinations don't appear to groups. They're individual, private experiences, more like a dream. So, you know, my wife and I this weekend are going on a little getaway for 3 days. And one way we could have saved money if I had woken my wife up and said, man, I just dreamed that we're in Hawaii. Go back to sleep and join me in Hawaii. Now, of course, that's funny. And she'd laugh at me and think, you know, what's the matter with you? Are you losing your mind? Because you can't share a dream with somebody. It's an individual experience. Well, the same is true of the hallucination. They're individual experiences. And the earliest records we have are of multiple different group experiences. Now, there's many other objections at this, and we can walk through them if you want to, but consistently, if you take the known facts that Jesus lived, that he died, that he was buried, that we have these reports of him appearing to people and changed lives, all these other explanations in some fashion outside of the resurrection fail to account for the known facts. And that's why I think when it's all said and done, a while ago you were talking about, people can look at the facts, why don't they believe? I don't think it's really an issue of the facts. People agree about the facts. They differ over the interpretation. And I really think it's a worldview issue. So for people, if they don't believe that there's a God, if they don't believe that God speaks, it doesn't matter how powerful of evidence you give for the resurrection, they will write it off. But if they're open to the possibility and willing to follow the evidence, then I think you'll find some of the smartest people throughout history, people like C.S. Lewis and like J. Warner Wallace and Simon Greenleaf, convinced by the evidence that it was really true.
Yeah, I think that, sorry, let me just turn my mic down a little. Hopefully that worked. Yeah, there we go. So one of the things that I think is really important, first of all, thank you for reviewing that, because I find it very compelling. Secondly, and I think almost everybody said this, but J. Warner Wallace especially, I think, emphasized this point where he said, listen, you can draw other conclusions from these facts. You can now surmise, you know, this is how it happened, or this is what happened, or this would happen. He said, but just ask yourself the question, what is the most probable explanation for this? That's like right. You're saying, oh, well, it's a hallucination. Okay, but let's look at that. You can still try to hold on to that, but it's not really the best explanation, you know. So I think it's really important, and I love the distinction you made, is that the facts are not really what's in contention. It's interpreting the facts or what they mean or the conclusions from those facts. That is really where maybe the departures come. So I find that, you know, so I think that's a great context to be observing this. And just, you know, there's so many of you out there. First of all, thank you everybody for joining. Two quick things, you know, and then we'll have a little final part of this. Number one, if you want to review the entire Christ Revealed series, we're just now tonight relaunching it again for Easter. It's free to view. You can go, and there's a link that's on the Facebook thread. You're looking at me right now on the and Sean in this viewing box. Below that, if you scroll down, is a Facebook thread, and probably a few comments down or near the top, you're going to see from a Christ Revealed post a link that says freeviewing.christrevealed.com. You can just go there. You can register, and day by day you'll get a new episode every day for the next 9 days of Christ Revealed, and it's free to watch. If any of you want to own Christ Revealed, again, right through the viewing box, you can click there and you can actually order the DVDs or order online access and watch it, you know, obviously at your convenience rather than the day-by-day release of the episodes. Either way, I just want you to see it. So I'm hoping that you'll take a look. We worked very hard on the project, and I believe that the information there will change your life. It changed my life, and it's changed the lives of many other people. It's inspiring. I think it's very engaging. I think there's a lot of fascination in what we uncover there, and quite frankly, some very surprising things. So go there, experience Christ Revealed. And I would recommend doing it with your family. You know, it's not too many things you can do with the whole family nowadays, but this is one of them. So put your family, you know, in front of Christ Revealed, let them absorb it, and then have a conversation about it after. That's the kind of conversations I feel like we should be having. They matter. So final words, Sean. Again, you know, before I have you start those, thank you again. I mean, you know, it's nighttime. You're taking your time away from your family, your work, what have you, to come and share with the Christ Revealed community. So thank you for doing that. Any final things you'd like to say to people going into this Easter holiday?
Oh, my goodness. I'm honored to be on the show. I've heard from people all around the world, including some of my wife's family, said, hey, we saw you in Christ Revealed. They were pretty excited. I've had people from the community contact me on Twitter, through Facebook, through my website, and I've loved to interact with as I can. Let me just encourage you. You're asking the right questions. You are definitely taking the most important question that Jesus said, who do you say that I am? Which gets lost in our busy culture today. And you're helping people wrestle with it. And I want to commend you for that. That's what I teach at Biola. I have a whole class on the resurrection where we walk through the historicity of it. And I want people to know that we don't have to be afraid of these questions. You know, what's amazing is every single religion wants Jesus on their side. You ever notice that? Islam, Jesus is a virgin-born, sinless, miracle-working prophet. Many Jews would say Jesus was a good Jew. He just was wrong on some of his teaching. Many atheists will say he's a good moral teacher. Buddhists will say he's enlightened. Hindus will say he's a guru. New Agers will want him as an enlightened kind of guru. Everybody wants Jesus. He's had more influence on the world than anybody who's ever lived, hands down. And the reason is because of the stories that he told, but more important than that is the person that he is. And I just invite anybody who's listening, you're obviously taking the time because you care about these questions, but to really maybe read the Gospel of John, along with watching Christ Revealed, and ask, who is this person, Jesus? Why does he turn the world upside down so much? Why does everybody want to claim Jesus for their side? And I think the answer is because he really is the Son of God. He rose on the third day, and his teachings have and still are transforming the world. So don't let this season go by with the busyness and stresses without slowing down and asking that question and focusing on it. That would be a shame.
Very wise words to end on here. Thank you so much. I really do wish all of you a very joyous Easter, and also an Easter that inspires, something that becomes meaningful for you and for those that you care about. Sean, you're just such a bright light, and you articulate the message so well. So I thank you for taking your time here. I hope in the coming months we can have you on again and talk about different subjects. This community just can't get enough of you. So thank you. And for everybody, again, thanks for joining. Great to be with you in this Christ Revealed community, and look for ongoing communications from us. We'll be doing more of these. Some of you, incidentally, had said, hey, how can I watch the beginning? I came in halfway through. As soon as we end here, this page will stay up. It will be posted. The replay will just be going. And you can send other people here, too, to come watch. So if you got any friends you want to send a link to, it's all free. Just send them over here and let them watch this conversation, and hopefully it will set up their Easter just right. Thanks again, Sean, so much.
Thanks for having me.
Take care, everybody.